The cold bit deep into Harmony Creek, a small collection of shacks and stoic stone houses huddled in the relentless shadow of the Appalachian peaks. Autumn had painted the mountains a defiant crimson and gold, but down in the valley, a perpetual grime of coal dust muted the colors, clinging to everything like a shroud. The year was 1901, a time when desperation was as common as the morning mist, especially after the collapse of the latest, bloodiest mine strike. Men were adrift, their faces etched with hunger and defeat. Eleanor Vance watched it all from her wagon, parked discreetly near the abandoned mine entrance. She was a woman of sturdy bone and tougher spirit, her widow's weeds a little faded, her expression unreadable. Eleanor was the keeper of the Stone Hearth, a decent, isolated farm her late husband had built, miles from the town's judgmental eyes. People in Harmony Creek called her the Iron Widow, a fool, and a lonely eccentric in equal measure. She had money, not much but enough, from a secret sale of timber rights, and that made her both envied and mistrusted. Today she wasn't looking for supplies, she was looking for a man. The makeshift camp was a sea of ragged tents and sputtering fires, populated by men who had lost everything. They were selling whatever scraps of their old lives remained, pocket watches, worn boots, even wedding rings. Then she saw him. He was standing apart, a colossal figure leaning against a stack of broken crates. His clothes were little more than rags, his face shadowed by a week's worth of black stubble, and his eyes. They were the color of slate under a stormy sky, vacant, yet holding a terrible, contained stillness. He wasn't selling anything. He looked like he was being sold. A burly man named Jeb, known for his harsh dealings and even harsher temper, approached the stranger, prodding him roughly with a stick. "Look here, folks. Found this one wandering the railroad tracks a week ago. Strong as an ox, doesn't talk much. I'm tired of feeding him. A good day's labor is worth more than a plate of beans. Who'll take him for $20? He's got no name, no papers, just muscle." A nervous ripple went through the crowd. This was not chattel slavery, but it was dangerously close. A desperate, brutal indentured servitude fueled by poverty and a system that looked the other way. "He looks half dead, Jeb," shouted one miner, earning a sneer. "He's got the strength of 2 men, I tell you, just needs motivation," Jeb retorted. Eleanor Vance slowly climbed down from her wagon. The sudden silence that fell was thick, broken only by the crackle of a distant fire. All eyes fixed on her. The Iron Widow was making a scene. $20, Eleanor said, her voice clear and carrying, cutting through the frosty air. "I'll pay 25. Cash." Jeb's eyes widened, a greedy grin spreading across his face. The other miners muttered, disbelieving. $25 was a month's wages for many. "25, you say, Widow Vance? You'll have yourself a mute brute," Jeb laughed, holding out a dirty hand. Eleanor ignored the comment. She walked straight toward the quiet man. He didn't flinch, didn't move a muscle, merely watched her approach. Up close, his size was intimidating. His hands were scarred and massive, his knuckles white. "What's your name, man?" she asked, her gaze steady, searching his vacant eyes. He remained silent. After a long, strained moment, he slowly mouthed a word, a soundless whisper. "Silas." Eleanor nodded, a single, decisive movement. She turned back to Jeb, pulling a small, worn leather purse from her coat. She counted out 2 $10 bills and a 5, crisp and clean against the filthy palm of the man. "The bargain is made," she announced, the finality of her tone silencing any further protest. She looked back at the man, Silas, who hadn't taken his eyes off her. "Get in the wagon, Silas. We're going to the Stone Hearth. You work for me now." Silas didn't hesitate. He simply turned, his movements economical and swift, and climbed into the back of the wagon. The ease with which he settled in, the complete lack of emotion, sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. It was a man stripped of hope, or perhaps something far more fundamental. As the wagon pulled away, the murmurs from the crowd rose to a chorus of mockery and condemnation. "The fool woman bought a ghost. She'll be murdered in her sleep." That man has the eyes of a killer. Eleanor drove on, refusing to look back. The stone hearth was miles away, isolated, surrounded by dense, unforgiving forest. Inside the cab, she could feel Silas's silent, massive presence behind her. She had paid a high price for help, but as the darkness of the mountain roads began to swallow the daylight, a cold, sharp dread pierced her calculated confidence. She had bought a secret, not a servant, and secrets in the remote, unforgiving mountains of West Virginia always had a terrible price. If you found this beginning intriguing and want to know what dark secrets Silas is carrying and what Eleanor's true motives are, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription helps us bring more chilling, realistic stories like this to life. The journey to the stone hearth was conducted in heavy, strained silence. The rough, unpaved road wound deeper into the mountains, leaving the smoke and judgment of Harmony Creek far behind. Eleanor Vance kept her eyes fixed on the flicker of the lantern mounted beside her, listening to the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the unsettling quiet emanating from Silas. When they finally arrived, the stone hearth was a formidable sight in the moonlight. A large, squat farmhouse built of rugged grey stones, its windows dark and uninviting. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress against the encroaching wilderness and the judgment of men. The isolation was profound. The nearest neighbor was over 5 miles away, and the only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. Eleanor stepped down first, her movements betraying none of the tension coiling in her gut. She was a woman who lived by routine and control, and Silas was the most unpredictable element she had introduced into her life. "We have work to do, Silas," she stated, her voice devoid of warmth, purely transactional. "The barn needs securing before winter, and the woodshed is nearly empty." Silas emerged from the back of the wagon, his shadow stretching long and monstrous across the yard. He looked around, not with curiosity but with a cold, professional assessment of his new environment. He was still silent. "You'll sleep in the small cabin by the spring," Eleanor instructed, pointing towards a derelict structure nestled near the tree line. "It's damp, but it's sound. I'll bring you bedding and food." She led him to the cabin. It was barely habitable, a single room with a rudimentary cot and a stone hearth that needed repair. As she laid out a wool blanket and a thin mattress, Silas watched her, his expression still that vacant slate. "There are 2 rules here, Silas," she said, straightening up, meeting his stare directly. "You do the work I assign, and you stay out of the house. This is my home, and you are my hired hand. Nothing more." Silas gave the smallest possible nod, a near imperceptible movement of his chin. It wasn't deference. It was acknowledgement. It was then Eleanor noticed a subtle detail she hadn't seen in the bustling camp. A fading, ugly scar that ran from the corner of his jaw and disappeared beneath his collar, suggesting a brutal past. That night, Eleanor ate her solitary dinner in the vast, echoing dining room of the stone hearth. The house was meticulously clean, every item in its place, reflecting her need for order. But the silence in the house, usually her comfort, was now oppressive, filled with the presence of the man sleeping just a few hundred yards away. A knock came at the door late in the evening. Eleanor instinctively reached for the iron poker by the fireplace before opening it cautiously. It was Martha Collins, her neighbor and only confidant, her face pale with worry, wrapped in a thick shawl. "Eleanor, you must be insane," Martha whispered, rushing inside and pulling the door shut behind her. "The talk in Harmony Creek is poison, buying that brute. They say he's a criminal, a runaway from the rail gangs. Jeb implied he was a murderer." Eleanor walked to the liquor cabinet, pouring a measure of medicinal brandy into 2 glasses. "Jeb is a bully and a liar, Martha. The man is strong and I need the help. I can't manage this place alone anymore. The price was fair for the labor. The price was a mistake. You paid a king's ransom for trouble," Martha insisted, taking the glass with a trembling hand. "He hasn't spoken a word, they say. He looks like something the mountains spat out. They are all convinced he's going to do you harm, Eleanor. And who will know? You're miles from anyone." Eleanor sighed. taking a deliberate sip of her brandy. Let them talk. Their gossip has no dominion over me, Martha. I am safe here. And as for Silas, he knows the bargain. Work or starve. That is the only language these mountains understand. What if he doesn't just want food, Eleanor? What if he wants revenge? Or what if he's running from something worse than Jeb? Martha pressed, her voice cracking with fear. Eleanor walked to the heavy, leaded window, peering out into the dense black woods. The moon had disappeared behind the clouds, plunging the farm into darkness. "Then I will handle it," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a low, cold register. "I have survived the mine owners, the winter, and the endless pity of this miserable town, Martha. A silent man does not frighten me. A hungry, desperate man is predictable. I simply want my wood stacked, my fences mended, and my harvest brought in. If Silas gives me that, I don't care what he did before I bought him." But Martha's fear was contagious. As Eleanor watched the endless curtain of the night, she noticed a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the direction of the outbuildings. Thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of an axe meeting wood, steady and relentless. Silas was working. In the dead of night, in the damp, cold air, he was fulfilling his side of the bargain. The sound was comforting, evidence of his obedience. Yet the sheer inhuman stamina and the unnerving focus needed to work without light, without rest, sent a new wave of unease through Eleanor. "He's chopping wood," Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to Martha. "At this hour?" Martha hissed. "That's not normal, Eleanor. Men need sleep. They need rest." "He doesn't look like a normal man, Martha," Eleanor conceded, putting her glass down with a sharp click. "He looks like a man without a future, who understands the urgency of the present." "Go home, Martha, and don't repeat this conversation to anyone. I need this bargain to hold." Martha left reluctantly, her lantern bobbing nervously as she hurried away. Eleanor bolted the door, turned down the lamp, and listened to the thud, thud, thud from the darkness. She walked to her bedroom, passing the large, ornate desk in the hallway. On it lay a stack of old, water-stained legal papers, the reason she needed Silas, and the terrible truth behind her desperate purchase. It wasn't just the labor. It was a deadline, an impending threat that required absolute, silent loyalty. Eleanor lay in bed, the axe strokes her only lullaby. She was convinced her control was absolute. But in the deep quiet of the mountains, a terrifying thought surfaced. She hadn't bought a worker. She had bought a machine. And machines, when pushed past their limits, do not break. They turn destructive. The next morning, the woodpile was perfectly stacked, enormous and meticulously organized. Silas was gone, already working somewhere on the remote acreage. Eleanor was impressed, but also more unsettled than before. A man who needed no rest was a man she could never understand, let alone control. 2 weeks passed under a heavy canopy of grey skies and biting cold. Eleanor Vance's farm, the Stonehearth, had undergone a silent, unsettling transformation. Silas worked with a relentless, terrifying efficiency. Fences were mended, stones were cleared, and the sprawling acreage was brought into a rigid order it hadn't known in years. He moved like a shadow, taking his meager food rations and never once entering the farmhouse. The initial fear of the community, however, had curdled into bitter resentment and outright suspicion. They couldn't ignore the visible, almost immediate improvement of Eleanor's property. The contrast with their own struggling farms, suffering from the lingering economic blight of the mine strike, was too stark. Whispers grew louder in Harmony Creek, fueled by Pastor Thorne's moral outrage and Deputy Miller's growing sense of helplessness. "It's unnatural, the speed of it," Pastor Thorne declared to a small crowd outside the general store, his hands clasped tight behind his back. She purchased a man with no history, no soul, and now that man is thriving while honest, Christian men starve. There is a devilish luck at play here. Deputy Miller, a man with tired eyes and a badge that looked too heavy for his chest, listened with a frown. "It's hard work, Pastor. The widow Vance is a harsh employer, but it ain't a crime. The crime, Deputy, is the fear he instills. Thorne countered, gesturing towards the desolate road leading to the stone hearth. "No one dares go up there. People are afraid of that silent, hulking brute." The fear escalated that afternoon with the disappearance of Henry, the elderly, good-natured postman. Henry rode a mule and was known for his punctual, predictable route. He had been due to arrive in Harmony Creek at midday, having first made the isolated delivery to Eleanor Vance. When 2 hours passed and Henry didn't appear, Deputy Miller took his old rifle and his apprehension and rode out. He followed Henry's usual route, a narrow, muddy track winding through the dense woods. He found the first sign 2 miles from the stone hearth. Henry's mule, tethered loosely to an old oak, trembling with nervousness. The mailbags were still strapped to its back. There was no sign of the postman. Miller dismounted, his heart thumping a heavy, uneven rhythm against his ribs. The woods were unnervingly quiet. He searched the surrounding area for an hour, calling Henry's name until his voice was hoarse. There was no struggle, no blood, no sign of a fall. It was as if Henry had simply been plucked from the earth. Finally, Miller had no choice but to ride up the last stretch to the stone hearth. He found Eleanor by the newly repaired well, drawing water, the very picture of mundane domesticity. She wore a heavy apron and looked up with an expression of mild annoyance. "Deputy Miller," she greeted him. "What brings the law out this far? I haven't seen a taxman in months." "It's Henry, Widow Vance, the postman," Miller said, dismounting quickly. "He vanished. His mule is abandoned back on the path. Did you see him today?" Eleanor paused, letting the water spill from the bucket back into the well. "Henry came here around 11 a.m. He dropped off the usual advertisements and an invoice for fertilizer. I spoke to him for 2 minutes about the cold snap. He left immediately. Did you see anyone else on your property, Widow? Anyone at all?" Miller pressed, his eyes scanning the yard for the silent shadow he knew lived there. "Only my hired hand, Silas," Eleanor said calmly. "He was cutting the thicket near the east perimeter, miles from the road. I told you, Deputy, he keeps to his work." "Where is he now?" "He's likely finished the thicket. He's probably repairing the south barn roof. I don't follow him around, Deputy. He doesn't need supervision." Miller felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air temperature. The lack of concern in Eleanor's voice was either absolute innocence or expert deceit. "I need to ask him some questions, Widow. About the man he bought, I mean." "Silas." Miller corrected himself quickly, his formality slipping. "I need to see him." "Silas is a mute, Deputy. Or near enough," Eleanor replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. "He speaks only when required, and never more than a single word. He wouldn't have understood Henry's rambling anyway." "Nonetheless, I need to see him," Miller insisted, placing his hand on the butt of his pistol. Eleanor stepped aside, a motion of supreme confidence. "Be my guest, Deputy. Search the farm. But you will find nothing out of order, save for a massive amount of incredibly efficient labor." Deputy Miller spent the rest of the afternoon at the stone hearth. He found Silas on the south roof, handling heavy slate tiles with a horrifying grace. Silas looked down at the deputy, a silent, emotionless scrutiny that made Miller's skin crawl. Miller called up to him, asked him about Henry, and Silas merely pointed a massive hand towards the east perimeter, then resumed his work, turning his back to the officer. He interviewed Eleanor again, checked the cabin, the barn, the well. He found nothing. No forced entry, no struggle, no sign of Henry. Miller left the stone hearth around dusk, the mystery deepening the further he rode from the farm. He had to face the truth. Henry's disappearance was either a simple, unfortunate accident, or the community's worst fears were immediately realized by the man the widow bought. And if it was the latter, the widow was either complicit or frighteningly oblivious. As he rode back down the mountain, leaving the lights of the stone hearth fading in the distance, a frightening thought took root. Henry, the postman, was a link to the outside world, the bringer of news, the keeper of routines. His disappearance had effectively cut Eleanor Vance off. But did Eleanor Vance cut the link, or did Silas? And why? Back in Harmony Creek, the news of the abandoned mule and the missing postman detonated. Pastor Thorne's accusations found fertile ground in the collective terror. "The widow Vance has sealed herself in with a beast," Thorne roared that night. "She bought him to do her horrible bidding. We must act before the beast tastes blood again." Deputy Miller, exhausted and outmatched, watched the townspeople load their lanterns and prepare their own rifles. He knew he couldn't stop the inevitable. The fear had turned into a mob's resolve, and the target was clear: the silent man, Silas, and the eccentric woman who had paid a fortune for him. The first act of horror had occurred, not by a visible, bloody murder, but by a sudden, chilling absence. The stone hearth was no longer just a farm. It was a fortress containing a potential predator, and the town was coming for it. The sound reached the stone hearth an hour past midnight. The distant, uneven tramp of feet, punctuated by the nervous jingle of harness and the low, angry shouts of men. Eleanor Vance was awake. She had been sitting by the fire, drinking lukewarm coffee, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The disappearance of Henry had confirmed her position in the community, not merely an eccentric, but an immediate threat. She heard the roar of the makeshift mob before she saw them. About 20 men, led by a righteous-looking Pastor Thorne and reluctantly flanked by Deputy Miller, burst through the tree line and stopped short of the main house. Torches cast an oily, dancing light across the yard, highlighting the mob's faces, a mix of fear, anger, and drunken courage. Eleanor opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch, her figure stark against the lamplight spilling from the house. She wore a severe, dark dressing gown, and she held a double-barreled shotgun, casually resting the stock on her hip. "Good evening, gentlemen," she called out, her voice unnervingly calm. "Late hour for a social call. You'll track mud onto the porch." Pastor Thorne marched forward, stopping a safe distance from the muzzle of her weapon. "We are not here for pleasantries, Widow Vance. We are here for justice. That creature you purchased has taken Henry the postman. We demand you hand him over." "Silas is asleep in his cabin, Pastor," Eleanor stated, without a change in inflection. "And he has taken nothing, save the overgrowth from my fences." Henry rode in, delivered his post and rode out. If he met with misfortune on the road, that is a matter for the deputy, not a drunken lynch mob. "We found his mule," one of the men yelled. "He vanished between here and the oak tree. Only one path, widow, only one man." "He's a mute, widow," Pastor Thorne added, his voice rising in pitch. "He's an animal you've caged. Now step aside, or we will take him by force and search your entire property." Deputy Miller stepped forward, his face grim. "Eleanor, please, the town is afraid. We just want to ask him some questions. I can't hold them back much longer." "Ask him what, deputy?" "Where is the murder weapon? Where is the grave?" Eleanor challenged, her eyes unwavering. "There is no proof, deputy. There is only speculation and malice, and I will not tolerate trespass on my property based on gossip." As she spoke, a sound drew the eyes of the entire mob. The cabin door creaked open. Silas stepped out, framed in the dark doorway. He was massive, still half-dressed in a woolen undershirt, his powerful torso gleaming in the torchlight. He carried nothing, but his hands, those huge scarred tools, hung loosely at his sides. He looked not hostile but profoundly, distantly inconvenienced. His gaze swept over the angry torchlit faces without any discernible reaction. The mob fell utterly silent. The sheer physical presence of the man was a greater weapon than any rifle. The fire in their bellies was instantly replaced by a cold, stomach-turning dread. Pastor Thorne, despite his spiritual courage, swallowed hard. "Silas, tell us where the postman is. Did you harm him?" Silas stood immobile for a long, agonizing minute. Then he raised his hand and pointed a massive, accusatory finger, not at the mob, but directly behind Eleanor. "Yard," Silas stated, his voice a low, gravelly sound that seemed to scrape against the silence, a sound few of the townspeople had ever heard. It was one word, an answer to the accusation, but entirely ambiguous. The men exchanged terrified glances. Did he mean Henry was buried in the yard? Was he challenging them? Eleanor did not flinch. He means he was working in the yard, Pastor, miles from where Henry's mule was found. Pastor Thorne, emboldened by the small, single word of reply, took a step forward. We are searching the property now, Widow Vance, by the authority of the people of Harmony Creek. Eleanor raised the shotgun, the metallic click of the hammers being pulled back, echoing sharply in the quiet night. Every man instantly froze. The only authority on the stone hearth is mine, Pastor, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You step 1 foot past that porch, and you will be violating the sanctity of my home. If a shot is fired tonight, it will be in self-defense, and I will be acquitted, for all of you are trespassers with ill intent. The standoff lasted what felt like an eternity. The mob, united by fear, was now paralyzed by the very real threat of violence from an unflinching woman who had nothing to lose. They looked at the formidable widow, then at the silent monolith of a man behind her. Deputy Miller, seeing the immediate potential for bloodshed, intervened quickly. That's enough. We are leaving, gentlemen. We have no warrant, no proof, and no right to force entry. Go home. We will conduct a proper investigation tomorrow in daylight. Miller successfully convinced the most sensible among them to withdraw. The mob retreated, casting dark, resentful glances back at the stone hearth. They hadn't found Henry, but they had confirmed their deepest fears. Eleanor Vance was protecting a monster. Once the sound of their retreat had faded, Eleanor slowly lowered the shotgun. She felt a profound exhaustion, but also a sliver of triumph. She had stared them down. She turned to Silas, who was still standing by his cabin door, silent and massive. You were helpful, she said, her voice brittle with relief and a lingering terror. The word yard. They didn't know what you meant. Silas walked towards her slowly, coming to a stop just below the porch. He looked past her, into the dark living room, and then down at her, his deep-set eyes finally holding a glint of something she hadn't seen before. Calculation. Work, Silas repeated, the same low rasp. Yes, you need to get back to work, Eleanor agreed, nodding too quickly. Silas did not move. He only held her gaze for a beat longer, a flicker of intelligence replacing the vacant look. Then he turned and went back inside his cabin, closing the door softly. Eleanor closed and bolted the front door. She had faced down the town, but the real mystery, the real threat, was still residing just outside her protective walls. He hadn't said who he was protecting, or why he had remained silent for so long. The word yard echoed in her mind. She knew the mob misinterpreted it, but what did Silas truly mean? The ambiguity was a chilling psychological masterstroke, whether deliberate or accidental. Eleanor looked at the stack of old legal papers on her desk, the reason for her desperate bargain, and she realized the terrifying truth. The man she bought was far more dangerous than she had ever calculated, not because he was an animal, but because he was a man capable of strategic, terrifying silence. The morning after the failed Inquisition brought a fragile quiet to the stone hearth. The mountain air was crisp and clear, and the farm stood under the weak autumn sun, looking deceptively peaceful. Eleanor Vance felt the immense pressure of the past 24 hours settle upon her shoulders. She was isolated, despised by the community, and now the prime suspect in a disappearance. Her defense of Silas had been purely self-preservation. She knew that if they took him, they would eventually find the documents she had been hiding, and her entire world would collapse. The labor she required was not for the farm. It was for the clock ticking down to her ruin. She retreated to her study, a small, heavily locked room off the kitchen. She pulled a dusty metal lockbox from under a loose floorboard and extracted the core of her secret. A sheaf of old legal papers, water-stained and brittle. These were the deed and mortgage documents for the stone hearth, along with a recent, terrifying court summons. Eleanor's late husband, a proud, stubborn man, had entered into a disastrous high-interest mortgage with a consortium of mine owners years ago, believing he could pay it off with a new timber venture. He couldn't. The final, brutal document was an eviction notice. The property was to be seized in exactly 3 weeks. The consortium, wanting the land not for farming but for its rich vein of unmined coal, had been relentless. Eleanor had fought them in court for years, spending her savings on failed legal defenses. Now she was out of appeals and out of time. The only way to save the farm was to prove that the original contract was fraudulent, a task made impossible by the mine owner's deep pockets and corruption. She had one last desperate plan, an old obscure law that allowed a property owner facing foreclosure to transfer the deed to an individual who had contributed significant, documented and uncompensated improvements to the property. It was a legal Hail Mary. If she could transfer the deed to a trustworthy, loyal party before the final deadline, the consortium would have to restart the legal process, giving her time to find a solution. That trustworthy party needed two crucial things: utter silence about the arrangement and physical protection from the community's interference. This is why she had bought Silas. Eleanor reread the key passage of the old law, proof of substantial material and undocumented improvements made by a dedicated party for nominal compensation. She hadn't just bought Silas's labor, she had bought the legal justification for the deed transfer. She paid him a pittance and was meticulously documenting every massive, uncompensated task he performed: the clearing of the entire east lot, the rebuilding of the ancient stone wall, the reconstruction of the entire south barn roof. These were tasks that would cost thousands of dollars if performed by professional contractors. The value of the improvements would need to drastically outweigh the paltry wages she was paying him. Silas's relentless, inhuman efficiency was not a quirk. It was an essential component of her survival strategy. The faster he worked, the more value she could claim, and the stronger her legal defense would be. But now, Henry was missing, and the town was convinced Silas was a killer. Her legal savior had become a massive liability. A heavy, deliberate knock sounded on the study door. Eleanor quickly shoved the papers back into the box and hid it. "Yes," she called out, her voice tight. The door creaked open, and Silas stood there. He was still wearing the same grime-covered work clothes. He wasn't holding anything, but his presence filled the small room, making the air thin. "East lot. Clear," he said, his gravelly voice low. Another 1,000+ words of documented improvement were completed. "Thank you, Silas," she replied, trying to sound normal. "The west pasture needs the rock wall rebuilt. It's heavy work. It's nearly 300 feet. "Good," Silas responded, the word carrying a strange, almost eager intensity. He looked around the study, his eyes lingering on the heavy desk and the locked drawers. Did you see anyone yesterday, Silas? Near the road?" Eleanor asked, her heart hammering. "The postman, Henry." Silas looked at her, his expression returning to its blank, unsettling state. He didn't answer. He simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the crushing weight of her fear. His silence was deliberate. It was his greatest asset, but now it was her worst terror. He knew she needed him to be silent about their arrangement, but why was he being silent about Henry? Eleanor knew she had to find out what really happened to Henry, not just for the town's sake, but for her own. If Silas was truly a murderer, his presence on the deed would invalidate her entire plan and condemn her not only to foreclosure but to ruin. She had to break through his silence, or she would lose everything to the deadline, the mine owners, and the man she bought. She put on her coat, picked up a shovel, and headed to the east lot. She had to see the work he had done. She needed a reason to believe in his innocence or proof of his guilt. She walked towards the newly cleared field, where a vast amount of scrub and rock had been pulled from the earth. The air was colder here, closer to the dense forest. As she reached the cleared area, she saw Silas walking away towards the west pasture, already beginning to stack the massive field stones for the new wall. Eleanor walked onto the lot, looking at the raw, overturned earth. Everything was piled neatly, the wood in one heap, the roots in another, the stones ready for transport. The ground was hard, frozen at the surface but freshly broken beneath. Then she saw it. Lying half-covered by a pile of roots, glinting in the faint sunlight, was a single ordinary object, a brass button, the kind used on a postal carrier's uniform coat. Henry's uniform. Eleanor gasped, stepping back quickly. She looked around frantically. Silas was too far away to have seen her find it. The button was proof that Henry had been here, on the Stone Hearth property, and that Eleanor had lied to Deputy Miller. But if Henry had been here, why had Silas not mentioned it? And why was there no body? The button was not enough to justify murder, but it was enough to prove contact and deception. A terrifying realization washed over her. Silas wasn't just a laborer. He was a silent, calculating participant in her isolation. He was creating the crisis, forcing her to rely on him more and more. The button was a message. A quiet, horrifying signal that the control she thought she had purchased had been subtly, irrevocably inverted. Eleanor Vance, the Iron Widow, was now a pawn in the silent man's own terrifying game. Eleanor spent the remainder of the day grappling with the brass button. She hadn't dared to touch it, only observing its position, half buried in the debris. She was paralyzed. If she showed it to Miller, she would implicate herself in the cover-up and confirm the town's suspicion of Silas. If she kept it hidden, she became an accessory to a potential murder. That evening, Martha Collins arrived again, exhausted and frantic. She had ridden over under the cover of darkness, bringing a basket of bread and a wave of fresh fear. "They're organizing, Eleanor. The men are planning to corner Miller and force him to get a warrant. They want to tear this place apart. They're saying you're just as culpable as that brute." Martha rushed out, placing the basket on the table. Eleanor stood by the stove, stirring a pot of simple stew, the rhythm of the spoon against the iron the only predictable sound. "They're welcome to try, Martha. I'll meet them with the shotgun again." "No, you can't. This isn't just a property dispute now, Eleanor. This is a man's life." "Henry was a good man," Martha cried, finally collapsing onto a kitchen chair. "Tell me, Eleanor. Look at me. Did you see anything? Did you know that man Silas before you brought him here?" Eleanor stopped stirring and leaned on the stove, her posture suddenly aged and weary. The silence stretched until it felt like a scream. She looked at Martha, her only true ally, and saw not judgment, but genuine, desperate concern. "I need your help, Martha," Eleanor finally whispered, her control cracking. "Not your counsel. Your help." She walked to the desk, pulled out the lockbox, and spread the eviction papers across the kitchen table. Martha stared at the legal documents, her face going pale as she read the dates and the names of the consortium. "The mine owners," Martha breathed, recognizing the pervasive evil behind the paperwork. "They want the coal." "They have the deed, Martha," Eleanor confirmed, her voice flat. "The final deadline is 3 weeks from Thursday. I am out of appeals. They will seize the Stone Hearth, and they will tear down every tree and dig up every stone until they have their coal." She pointed to the fine print of the old law. "This is my only defense. I can legally transfer the deed to an individual who has made substantial, uncompensated improvements to the land. I need those improvements to total more than the debt. Fast." Martha finally understood the desperate scale of the situation. "You bought Silas to beat the deadline. You bought his labor to save your home. I bought his silence and his loyalty, Martha. He barely speaks. He costs me nothing but food, and he works with the fury of a dozen men. I've been documenting every post, every stone, every hour. He is the only way I can build a case against the consortium in time." "But Eleanor, Henry," Martha said, her eyes welling up. "How can you be sure Silas didn't harm him? Your defense is built on a monster." Eleanor sank into a chair opposite her friend, burying her face in her hands. The Iron Widow was gone, replaced by a terrified woman. "I don't know, Martha. I truly don't know. I've been so focused on the deadline that I haven't let myself think about Henry." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I lied to Miller. Henry was on the property. I found this in the east lot this morning." Eleanor opened her palm, revealing the small tarnished brass button from the postman's uniform. Martha gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Dear God, Eleanor, you have to tell the deputy. This is evidence. If I show this, they'll arrest Silas immediately. The work stops. The deed is lost. The consortium wins. Eleanor pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. And I go to jail for obstruction. This farm, this stone, this earth, it's all I have left. I can't let those devils take it. Then you are choosing the farm over Henry's life. Martha accused, her voice sharp with moral condemnation. I am choosing survival, Martha. For me, and for the hope of justice against those powerful men. I can't be sure Silas killed him. There was no blood, no struggle. Maybe Henry was confronted, and he lost the button during a scare, and then fled. Eleanor's voice was now desperate, the defense clearly tailored to her own need to believe. You need to know the truth, Eleanor. You cannot sign this deed over to a killer. You will be tied to him forever. Martha insisted, her voice calmer now, realizing the depth of the trap her friend was in. But how can I know? He won't talk. He speaks one word at a time, Eleanor, and you paid a high price for him. You need to use the only power you have left. The bargain. Martha stood up, her courage returning. I'll ride back to town. I'll keep the men calm for one more night. But you, Eleanor, you have to find out what really happened to Henry. You have to face the man you bought and demand the truth. Your life and your farm depend on it. And if he did do it, you have to turn him in, no matter the cost. Eleanor stared at the button, the symbol of her moral compromise. She had to choose between her home and the moral high ground. The silence of Silas had become a terrifying cage, holding the answer she both desperately needed and absolutely dreaded. The kitchen was dark again, save for a single flickering kerosene lamp. Eleanor Vance stood by the back door, gripping a leather strap containing 3 freshly polished silver dollars. A meager payment for the monumental amount of labor Silas had completed. She felt the weight of Martha's words, the terror of the deadline, and the cold, hard certainty that she could not proceed unless she broke Silas's silence. She walked out into the cold night. The cabin was dark, a solid black square against the backdrop of the pines. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, a gesture of respect she hadn't afforded him before. "Silas," she called out, her voice firm, despite the frantic beating of her heart. "I need to talk to you. Now." She heard a slow movement inside, a rustle of fabric, and the heavy door opened. Silas stood there, completely filling the frame. His eyes, normally so vacant, were now sharp, alert, and entirely focused on her. "What?" he asked, his voice rough. Eleanor stepped into the small, damp cabin. The air was cold, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. She kept her distance, ensuring the open door provided her an escape. "I have your pay," she said, holding out the strap of silver coins. "But I have something else that belongs to you, Silas. The truth." She closed her hand around the brass button she had found, keeping it hidden. "The town is coming back, Silas. The mob will come with a warrant, and they will drag you out of here. If they find proof you harmed Henry the postman, everything ends. I lose the farm, and you lose your shelter. Our bargain is broken." Silas remained still, watching her with a terrifying lack of expression. He didn't reach for the money. "Did you harm Henry, Silas?" she demanded, the question tearing through her carefully constructed composure. He shifted his weight, and for a fleeting second, Eleanor saw a deep, unreadable conflict in his eyes. "No," he said, the single word a solid, uncompromising denial. Eleanor didn't know whether to believe him. She pressed harder, holding out the small, dark button. "Then explain this," she insisted, dropping the button onto his cot. It glinted under the faint lamplight. "Henry's uniform button. I found it in the east lot where you were working. He was here, Silas. I lied to the deputy for you. Now, you tell me the truth. Why was he here? And where is he now?" Silas picked up the button, his massive thumb tracing the insignia. He looked at the button, then back at Eleanor, a slow, calculated fire entering his gaze. "He followed," Silas explained, the words now coming in slow, deliberate fragments, no longer a single-word reply. "He saw I took his mail. He ran. Eleanor was dumbfounded. He followed you? Followed you where? Saw what? Silas did not answer the second part of the question. He pointed towards the floor of the cabin, then to the wooden cot, then back to the button. Mail, no money, papers, hidden. He saw. He wanted more. Eleanor's mind raced. Silas had been working in the east lot, the furthest, most isolated part of the farm. Henry, the nosy postman, must have seen Silas hiding something. Not a body, but papers. The court papers, Eleanor whispered, realizing the horrific possibility. The mine owners, they knew the deadline. Henry was a simple man, but he was loyal to the town and perhaps to the wrong pockets. If Henry had been sent to find the deeds or the legal strategy to disrupt Eleanor's defense, then Silas had interrupted a break-in, not committed a murder. "What did you hide, Silas?" she demanded, urgency flooding her voice. Silas looked straight into her eyes, and the connection, raw and absolute, was terrifying. He was no longer her bought servant. He was an equal in a pact of fear. "My papers," Silas finally confessed, his voice dropping to a low, powerful rumble. "My debt. My life." Eleanor didn't understand. She had bought him from Jeb with cash. Silas took a deep, rattling breath. "I was a miner, not a runaway. I led the first strike. I spoke for the men. They beat me, broke my jaw. They said if I worked off my debt, my wages, my voice, my life, they would let my family live. Jeb was the front for the mine boss, not a sale, a trade." Silas's story was a terrifying mirror of her own. She was fighting to save her home. He was fighting to save his family, both pitted against the same brutal system of ownership and debt. "They took my family's papers, my identification. They own me until the debt is paid. I am an undocumented man, Eleanor." Silas finished, the admission heavy with decades of suffering. "I took Henry's mail because he was looking for my papers, not yours. He was working for the mine owners." Eleanor stood motionless. The terror of the situation was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Silas wasn't a killer. He was a desperate man fighting his own battle against the mine owners, and their paths had collided violently. He was hiding his own papers, just as she was hiding hers. The button proved Henry had been on the property, sent to spy. "Our enemies are the same, Silas," Eleanor said, holding his gaze. "The deadline is 3 weeks. If I lose the deed, they will find your family. If they find Henry, they will have you arrested, and I lose my legal defense. We are tied together. I need your work. You need my silence." Silas nodded, a firm, sharp movement. He was now her willing, if terrifying, partner. "Where is Henry now?" she asked, her voice quiet. Silas pointed to the dark mouth of the cabin's stone hearth. "I locked the cabin." He ran. Into the woods. Eleanor finally believed him. Henry had escaped, frightened by the mute giant, fleeing with nothing but his life. He was hiding, too afraid to come back and admit he was spying for the mine owners. "We continue the work, Silas," Eleanor commanded, her voice regaining its strength. "The wall in the west pasture must be finished by Sunday. We will complete the improvements and we will win the legal battle. Then we will deal with the missing postman." She placed the silver dollars on his cot. "The money is proof of nominal compensation. Do not spend it. Do not be seen. Just work." Eleanor turned and left the cabin, the heavy wooden door closing with a definitive thud. She walked back towards the house, the silence no longer oppressive, but a heavy, functional armor. She had crossed the moral line, becoming an accomplice not to murder, but to a vast, necessary deception. The mountains had a way of mirroring the internal state of the community. 2 days after the failed mob action, a fierce early winter storm descended upon Harmony Creek, burying the valley in a fresh, heavy layer of snow and a crippling cold. The storm served to intensify the town's fear, trapping them and amplifying the feeling of helplessness against the isolated power of the stone hearth. Deputy Miller sat in his drafty office, staring at a map of the Stone Hearth farm, feeling the pressure of the town like a physical weight. Pastor Thorne was demanding a state investigation, and the consortium's local lawyer had arrived in town, quietly gathering information. A sign that the mine owners were not just concerned about Henry, but about Eleanor's defiance. A sudden, sharp knock on his door interrupted his troubled thoughts. It was Martha Collins, bundled in a thick coat, her face flushed from the cold. "Deputy Miller, I have to talk to you," she said, pulling the door shut quickly. Her voice was low and urgent. "It's about Eleanor, isn't it?" Miller sighed, gesturing to a chair. "I know she's protecting that man. I just can't prove it. The snow has made the search impossible." "It's about the mine owners, Deputy," Martha corrected, leaning in. She then revealed the full truth of Eleanor's situation, the eviction notice, the fraud, and the desperate, obscure legal strategy of the deed transfer through uncompensated improvements. "She's fighting for her home, Deputy," Martha pleaded. "The mine owners have wanted that coal for years. They drove her husband to ruin. They are ruthless." Miller listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to cold realization. The consortium's presence in town suddenly made perfect sense. They weren't looking for Henry. They were looking for a loophole, a weakness in Eleanor's defense. "So, the work Silas is doing, that's the legal defense?" Miller clarified. "Yes. It has to be significant and documented. That's why he works so hard. And that's why they need him gone before the deadline." "And Henry?" Martha hesitated, then recounted Eleanor's discovery of the button and her agonizing decision to hide it. She also shared Silas's desperate confession. The debt, the captured papers, the suspicion that Henry was a spy. Silas says Henry saw him hiding his own family's papers, the ones the mine owners took. He says Henry ran, scared, when Silas confronted him. He never came back to his mule. Martha insisted. "Eleanor believes him, Deputy. They are fighting the same enemy." Miller slowly tapped his pen on the desk. This version of events, a conspiracy and not a murder, was far more chilling and far more plausible. It explained Silas's silence, Henry's disappearance without a struggle, and Eleanor's fierce protection of her hired hand. If Henry is alive, he's hiding because he was working for the consortium. He's afraid to come back and admit his betrayal to the town. Miller mused aloud. "But that button proves Eleanor lied to an officer of the law, Martha. That's a serious charge." "And the mine owner's fraud is far worse," Martha countered. "Deputy, you know the truth about how they run this town. If you arrest Eleanor now, they win everything. You must protect her, not for the murder she didn't commit, but for the justice she is trying to enforce." Miller looked at the snow swirling outside, cutting off the valley. He had a choice. Uphold the letter of the law and allow a powerful corporation to ruin an honest woman, or bend the rules to serve a greater, harder-to-prove justice. He stood up, walking to the window. "I won't issue a warrant, Martha. Not yet. The town will scream, but I will tell them the snow makes the search impossible. This buys Eleanor a week, maybe 10 days until the storm clears." "Thank you, Deputy." Martha sighed, a wave of relief washing over her. "But you go back and tell Eleanor 2 things, Miller instructed sternly. "First, if I find one shred of evidence that man harmed Henry, I will come for him myself. Second, she needs to find Henry. If he is alive, his confession will not only save Silas, but it will expose the conspiracy and win her case. She needs to find the postman, Martha. He's the only proof of her innocence." Martha nodded quickly, her eyes full of hope. "I will tell her." As Martha prepared to leave, Miller had one final chilling thought. Silas's papers. The mine owners took them. What were they? "I don't know, Deputy. Eleanor didn't say," Martha replied, pulling her coat tight. "Find out," Miller ordered. "Those papers are the key to Silas and the key to everything else." Martha left, plunging back into the brutal cold. Deputy Miller was now deeply involved in the widow Vance's desperate scheme. He sat back down, picking up the map of the stone hearth, and drew a circle around the east lot where the button was found. He was no longer looking for a body. He was looking for a hiding place, a desperate man, and the truth that would bring down the powerful men who owned the mountain. The snow, a temporary shield, began to melt under a weak, insistent sun. The deadline for the foreclosure was looming, just 4 days away. Eleanor and Silas had worked with an impossible fury, fueled by the ticking clock and the knowledge of their common enemy. The west pasture wall was nearly complete, a monumental structure of interlocking stones, indisputable proof of Silas's uncompensated contribution. Eleanor now had the documented proof needed for her legal defense. She and Silas had worked side by side, silent partners in a high-stakes conspiracy. Yet the guilt over Henry and the anxiety of the looming court date left her exhausted and frayed. Deputy Miller's message delivered by Martha was clear. Find Henry, or lose everything. Eleanor was now a detective, forced to search her own property for the missing postman. She focused on the last known point of contact, the east lot where Silas was working and where the button was found. If Henry had been spying on Silas and then fled, he wouldn't have gone far, not in the sudden, brutal cold. She started her search at the edge of the east lot, following the line of the forest. The ground was slick with mud and melting snow. After an hour of agonizing, cold searching, she found something unusual near a dense stand of rhododendrons. A section of the underbrush looked broken, bent and recently disturbed, not by an animal, but by a human body crashing through it. Eleanor pushed through the thicket. There, curled under an overhanging ledge of rock, was Henry, the postman. He was alive, but barely. His face was pale and gaunt, covered in a week's worth of beard, and his eyes were wide with fright. He was shivering violently, huddled under a thin, soaking cloak. He looked more like a wild animal than a man. "Henry," Eleanor whispered, rushing to his side. "Henry, it's Eleanor Vance. You're safe now." Henry flinched, pulling away, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The devil," Henry rasped, his voice raw. "He's a beast, Eleanor. He took them. He took the papers. They told me to get them." Eleanor helped him sit up, pulling a blanket from her backpack around his shoulders. "I know, Henry. The mine owners sent you. They wanted to ruin me and they wanted Silas's family documents. Where are the papers now?" Henry pointed a shaking finger at the ground beside him. "The brute. He cornered me. Not to kill, but to steal. He took the documents they gave me, the originals. I dropped my bag, and I ran for days. Didn't dare go back to town. They would kill me for losing them." Eleanor quickly searched the area Henry indicated, finding his mail pouch, now empty of his deliveries but containing something far more critical. A small, sealed ledger. It was the consortium's accounting book for the entire region. Henry had stolen it during his spy mission, a desperate act of self-preservation to ensure he had something to trade for his life. She then looked where Henry was pointing. Hidden under the ledge, just beyond Henry's trembling feet, was a small, tightly wrapped bundle sealed with black wax. This was what Silas had hidden in the east lot. Silas's papers. Eleanor reached for the bundle, her hands trembling. She carefully broke the seal and spread the papers out. They were not only the debt notes from the mine owners, but also the original birth certificates and family deed for Silas's small ancestral farm, showing that the mine owners had illegally taken his land and used his family as leverage. But there was one final, horrific document. A certificate showing that Silas's wife and 2 children had been relocated to a remote mining camp under an assumed name, but that the debt note was set to expire in 2 days. If the debt wasn't paid or the family wasn't found, they would be reassigned to a state workhouse. The deadline was not just for the stone hearth. It was for Silas's family too. Eleanor realized the full scope of Silas's terror and desperation. His fierce labor wasn't just to repay his own debt. It was to ensure his location was stable and protected long enough for the note to expire and the mine owners to lose their legal claim to his family. "Henry," Eleanor said, pulling him close, "you have to come back with me. You have to tell Deputy Miller the truth. About the mine owners, about the spying, about the fraud. You can save Silas, and save me." Henry, however, had a final, devastating revelation. "Silas, He didn't just hide his own papers. He told me that Jeb, the man who sold him, Jeb found Silas's family location. He sent a runner to the camp 2 days ago. Silas has been working to buy his family back for months, but they found them. Silas knows he's out of time. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. Silas had finished his last monumental task, the west pasture wall, that morning. He had fulfilled his end of the bargain. He was free to go. And now, he had the truth that his family was found. Eleanor looked back towards the stone hearth. The figure of Silas, massive and quiet, was walking away from the farm, cutting straight across the west pasture, heading towards the deep, unyielding forest. He wasn't running. He was moving with the terrifying focus of a man who had nothing left to lose. He had finished his work. Now, he was going to collect his family. And Eleanor knew, with a sinking horror, that a man with Silas's strength and desperation, no longer bound by silence or work, would do truly horrible things to save the ones he loved. The day of the foreclosure deadline broke cold and clear. Eleanor Vance, accompanied by a recovered, terrified Henry the postman, arrived in Harmony Creek an hour before the consortium's lawyers were due to file the final seizure papers. She went directly to Deputy Miller's office, the bundle of Silas's papers and the consortium's ledger clutched tightly in her hands. "Henry is alive, Deputy," Eleanor announced, slamming the evidence onto Miller's desk. "And the whole town is wrong. This was never about murder. It was about fraud, greed, and the illegal enslavement of a desperate man." Henry, pale and shivering, quickly recounted his tale. The spying mission for the consortium, his discovery of Silas's hidden family documents, and his subsequent terror-fueled flight into the woods. Miller, his face grim, quickly read through Silas's papers. The debt note, the birth certificates, and the final notice of family reassignment. He saw the full, horrifying picture. The mine owners had used the strike to capture land and people, forcing men like Silas into brutal service. "They're going to seize your farm and claim Silas's family," Miller stated, looking at the clock. "The lawyers will be here in minutes." "They won't," Eleanor said with fierce resolve. "I have the ledger, this proves their fraud, and I have the transfer of deed, signed and dated, proving the uncompensated improvements far exceed the debt." "But Silas isn't here, Eleanor. You can't transfer the deed to a man who has fled," Miller protested. "Silas didn't flee, Deputy. He went to save his family. He left last night, heading straight for the camp they sent them to. He has the strength, and he has the reason. I just hope he's not too late." Just then, the outer door of the office burst open. Pastor Thorne, followed by 2 well-dressed, arrogant lawyers from the consortium, strode in. "Deputy Miller, we are here to finalize the seizure of the Stone Hearth farm," the lead lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Mr. Finch, announced, a smug look on his face. "And we are demanding a warrant for the arrest of the fugitive, Silas." "Silence, Mr. Finch," Deputy Miller commanded, raising his voice for the first time in years. "I have evidence here that suggests not a murder, but a widespread conspiracy of fraud and coercion perpetrated by your clients, the consortium." Miller pointed to Henry. "This man was a spy for your company, sent to disrupt the widow Vance's legal defense. And these documents prove your company illegally seized the family of a local man, Silas, forcing him into indentured servitude." Finch laughed, a short, contemptuous sound. "The documents are irrelevant, Deputy. We have the legal deed. The farm is ours. We have the seizure order, and your witness, Henry, is a known liar." Eleanor Vance stood up, her hand slamming down on the deed transfer document. "You are too late, Mr. Finch. The deed is no longer in my name. It was legally transferred to Silas this morning, the man who performed substantial, uncompensated improvements to the property, the value of which far exceeds the remaining debt." Finch's face went white. "You fool! You transferred the deed to a fugitive, a man wanted for murder. The transfer is void. The law will never uphold it." "He is not a fugitive, Mr. Finch. He is the rightful owner, and he is wanted for nothing," Eleanor countered, pointing to the documents. Henry confirms he is alive, and I have evidence that Silas's disappearance was motivated by your client's threat to his family. Not a crime. The argument raged. Finch threatened lawsuits, Miller threatened arrest, and Eleanor stood her ground. Just as the confrontation reached its fever pitch, the office door was pushed open once more. Silas walked in. He was covered in mud and snow, his face grimy, but his eyes were no longer vacant. They held a fierce, exhausted light of victory. He was holding the hands of a woman and two small, frightened children. His family. "Silas," Eleanor whispered, relief flooding her. "The debt is done, Mrs. Vance," Silas said, his voice now clear, though still rough. "They are free. The law is the only freedom." Silas had reached the camp, found his family, and used the evidence of the expiring debt note to force the local overseer to release them with the sheer, frightening strength of a man who would not be denied. Deputy Miller looked at the family, then at the defeated lawyer, Mr. Finch. "Silas is no longer a fugitive, Mr. Finch. He is the owner of the Stonehearth farm, and I suggest you take this evidence of fraud and leave my county immediately before I call the state troopers." Finch, realizing the game was up, Silas was no longer silent, Henry was alive, and the ledger was damning, snatched his briefcase and fled. Eleanor approached Silas, looking at his family with a genuine emotional relief. "You are free, Silas, and the farm is safe. Our bargain is complete." Silas looked down at her, the unbought man, finally in control of his own fate. "The Stonehearth is not my home, Eleanor. It is yours. My family needs a new life, and I know what must be done with this farm." Silas then did the final unbelievable thing. He took the new deed, endorsed it, and transferred the ownership back to Eleanor Vance with one condition. "You saved my family, Eleanor. The Stonehearth is yours. But the mine owners will always come back. I will work for you, not as a bought man, but as a free man, a partner, to protect this land and to protect your home, until the day the last mine owner is gone from this mountain." Eleanor Vance, the Iron Widow, was finally safe. She had won her farm back, not by money or legal cunning alone, but by a desperate human pact, formed out of mutual fear and a common enemy. Everyone had called the widow a fool for buying a man, but the truly horrible things Silas did were not acts of violence, but acts of incredible, relentless labor and terrifying strategic silence, all to save his family and destroy the powerful men who owned the mountain. The town, seeing Henry alive and the mine owners defeated, finally understood. Eleanor Vance was no fool, and the silent man was not a beast. They were two desperate souls who found a terrible, necessary salvation in the cold, unforgiving mountains of West Virginia. The Stonehearth remained, a defiant stone sentinel against the greed of the valley, protected by the man who was bought but never truly owned.